Our state of being depends on the condition of that with which we are identified. Our state of being depends upon the condition of that with which we are identified. And this doesn't mean that we can pick and choose what we identify with and expect our state of being to change accordingly. There has to be a belief, a true belief in being that thing with which there's identification. It doesn't have to be correct, though, because the default is to be identified with the body and the mind. And there is something incorrect about that identification, in that if you consider what most constitutes a self, yourself, it can be no more self than that which is aware of everything, where all that phenomena is received. So to be identified with the body and the mind while honest and honestly believed, it's not thought to be a lie or wrong. That's what gives it power. That belief gives it power. So long as there's identification with form and thought, there's going to be a certain lack of scope of perception. Attention is a zero-sum game. What's given to one thing cannot be given to another. And to give attention to an identification with what appears in awareness, it holds a place. It's like the place where idolatry goes and blocks connection with the truth, like carbon monoxide does to hemoglobin. It occupies that space. So identification occupies that space and only allows for the relative truth, because that with which there's identification is positional. It has positionality, so it cannot see objectively. It's always relative to what it's identified with. It has constituents, and its state depends upon those things. So there's disturbance in that hides the truth. There's distortion of reality. It's a buying into a conceptual narrative, which can only be in resistance to the moment, in that it always seems to propose something else than what's going on at that very moment. Because if what was in the mind coincided with the moment, that's what it means to be present, which typically happens only when some type of novelty appears, something interesting. Then there's a focusing, concentration. And then there's a feeling, and that feeling is wrongly attributed to the object of concentration. But all that thing outside is doing is making you feel a certain way inside. And again, the thing doesn't have to change the way it makes you feel, because it's all in you. So there's a belief that the enjoyment of a thing is somehow in the thing. That's an unconscious belief. You really couldn't get somebody to probably say that because it doesn't make sense, but I think unconsciously it's believed. So there are other types of identifiers that can affect your state of being if you choose to identify with them. They affect your state in a different way than the identification with the body. But ideas that are adopted as identity are a protectorate of the self. And while it wouldn't be a visceral fear that comes with the belief that one is the body when it's in peril, when one's ideas are countervailed, it creates a hurt inside. And people will take action based on that hurt. It's difficult to overcome a position that somebody holds as an identity. It can't be argued away. Just as a thought can't be countervailed with other thoughts within a mind, the positionality within an individual isn't going to be simply argued away in most cases. There'll just be a proliferation of argument, just as would occur in a mind, conflicting. It's really an undermining of positionality itself that can neutralize that type of insularity. There can't be peace in positionality. So unless you want to relinquish all of your opinions about things, and really the self to hold them, the identification with the self that holds those opinions, that's what gets relinquished. And in doing so, all those different contingencies are abandoned because they have no subject to which they can relate. So in the absence of relational thinking, there can still be thinking, but the thoughts don't relate to anyone. They appear in the awareness that one is, and as such, they are dependently originated. They arise from the causal chain, and they are phenomena being observed. It's not a change in opinion or idea or knowledge that changes perception. It's letting go. It's a letting go of things. And it doesn't necessarily have to start with the quest for self-knowledge. it can turn into a discovery of the nature of the self. But it may start as an exercise in dealing with unwanted thoughts. And in doing so, things are revealed about thoughts, namely that they are identified with as self in ignorance, that they are defended, that they, to the extent they're reacted to relative to what is, they change the state of being. And when they're surrendered, they leave a space, and that space, no longer being held by a position, can only be occupied by the truth, the non-relative truth of the divine will being expressed always in this moment, never in the mind. The mind is a thought, a group of thoughts. The mind is rooted in I. And the I is no longer identified with. Everything above that root is abandoned. And it doesn't matter how much wind blows through that husk, it's not felt. Beyond the peace, there is a lack of need. In the absence of identification with form and thought. There's a satisfaction that's not related to, or a peace that's not related to circumstance. It's as if when the heart becomes still and unobscured by opinions and identity, that which made the truth only relative is out of the way. And in that silence is room for the absolute truth, which shines like a light on the heart. It's a palpable light that's reflected and radiates through the form perpetually. The more space that's taken up with obsessive thoughts, the more the modality of surrender may change one's state of being. It's like there's a perception of a gap between phenomena and what's aware of it that reveals the non-self nature of the former. And there is then energy to deal with, potentially. And energy is better felt passively than acknowledged and focused on and encouraged. Attention can be relaxed, and the energy can be allowed to be perceived, and just like a passing phenomena. And it will be problematic if there's identification with thoughts, because the reaction to those thoughts relative to circumstance will color the energy body. And so there's a kind of a mandatory letting go when the energy body is really begins to be perceived, and there's no point of return. When that phenomena appears, it can be dangerous, because there's a feeling that one is special. But that is a hindrance. Just like the temptation to focus on energy and try to manipulate it is a hindrance. The belief that one is some kind of superhuman being, that becomes an identity, and that's a hindrance. It's not an additive process, and that's why building oneself up into something will hinder the non-additive process, the process of letting go. But if there's a special person who is going to be moved emotionally by the plight of that special person, then the truth becomes diminished. It's the perception of truth becomes diminished, because again, attention being a zero-sum game, it goes into all the cares, and that brings perception into the gross, the lower emotions, and body identification. So that with which there's identification, it's just another thing that is dependently originated, like everything else. Everything is the same, comes from the same source. And so the feelings appear over only that over which there's a claim, for which there's a claim. If there's a claim on anything that appears in awareness, then the truth will be obscured by the cares that are a product of ignorance, that arise from the plight of a thing in a dangerous world, a perishable thing in a dangerous world. So the truth isn't what is thought. The truth is what is. In the absence of identification of any ideas about it, the truth is not a narrative. The truth is an expression of divine will in this moment. An idea is an alternative that's proposed. And there's an opportunity cost to it. But it's just a leaf on the tree of self. So you can pluck off as many of those leaves as you like. You can deal with every unwanted thought in a suppressive way. and more thoughts will come, more leaves will grow. It'll just keep going like a weed. Only by cutting the root, uprooting the thing by the base of the structure, the I, the foundation, the realization that I is a concept, and it relates to the body, but the self is what's aware of that. And so there is a realization that what the first cause of this defines what's perfect. So our perception of imperfection is a function of what's good and bad for us. The world as created is perfect. It's man who resists its expression and wants to improve on it. There's an opportunity cost to that. There's a dimension that's hidden by care, but it is predicated on ignorance. It's likely that a trigger event can cause such a change, a realization of some kind occurs. There's a need to change because the suffering of the status quo demands it. And that's grace. When the non-self nature of phenomena is apparent, there's no sides to take. Like there's no there's a recognition certainly of the world as it is. There's an understanding that there are people who really care about how things turn out, or they have a strong idea about how it should be. It's not that it's irrational for them to care how things turn out, but they definitely have an idea about the way it should turn out. And because that idea runs counter to people with other ideas like that, there's conflict in the world. The ideas can't be overcome with better ideas necessarily, unless there's an agreement and an acknowledgement by all parties that that one idea is just obviously better. But barring that, war tells us that people really want their way. I heard a friend say that he never heard of a country of atheists massing at the border. And to that I would say, in the aggregate, people don't change. We look at history and can see that the paradigm is essentially kill the men, take the women, take their stuff. And it occurs whenever there's a technological edge or some kind of strength edge between in-group and out-group. History is replete with examples. As long as there's identification with form and thought, humans will have a need to fill an unfillable void within themselves with outside things. And those things are procured through power. The need for power is predicated on identification with form and thought. Without that, there's no impetus, because nothing that can be controlled in the world can bring a condition that eclipses just the truth, just the bare truth of the moment. So there's no need to change anything. But that realization is the product of not a changing of opinions, because it doesn't change the way the mechanism works. Having a different opinion or acknowledging the way a thing works doesn't change the way it works. There has to be a change in the way the thing operates. Like the unconscious belief in a thing. There's conscious belief in a thing and there's unconscious belief in a thing. Unconscious is the thing that brings the fear of death. Unconscious belief is the thing that brings the fear of death. Almost anything else can be tolerated, but not necessarily desired. But as long as that belief is real, then the emotional life, it's just going to be chaotic, because it's connected like a sprocket to the thought loop. As long as there's a relational thinking, there's a subject to which all these objects relates, there's going to be a movement between phenomena and the self-concept. And it will color the energy body accordingly. So there's stillness that's not the product of stopping the mind, but rather no honest reaction to what thoughts appear. They're all the product of experience. They're all dependently originated. They don't have to be claimed. They can just be. When they don't move anything, then that's a kind of stillness. And that is kind of a transforming the truth is transformational. The truth is transformational. You don't want to be wrapped up in a layer of thoughts that come between you and the truth. And that's why to lie separates. That's the mechanism by which a lie separates one from the truth. Or it obscures the perception of truth, because when a lie is being held, there's mandatory engagement with thoughts, schemes. It can't be escaped. If the lie is to be maintained, it is quite literally the separation from the truth to live in a lie. And so the whirls and loops of identity, all these little wonderful things about us, they're just like handcuffs. They're things to make us more comfortable. But there's no liberation in identification with them, because they have a fate. And the care for the fate of that thing creates a condition that's unknown by its experiencer, because it's the state of being. It's like the water for the fish. Until that is surrendered or gone, there's an amnesia of states. This state of awareness is children lose it, but have it. But the blanket of ideas that eventually becomes the 60,000 thought a day thought loop, it just obscures it all. It obscures that state, and there's an amnesia of states. It's forgotten that such a state can be just the product of being free, having space. And even if there's a lot of thoughts, space can be perceived in not being attached to them. Because the thought doesn't exist in the absence of attention. If the thought is not interesting, then it doesn't get any attention. So the energy that follows attention doesn't feed that thought. Surrendering to the feelings that underlie them diminishes the energy and magnetic pull to attention. And just letting them pass by unnoticed because they don't relate to anything that's identified with, they just sort of wisp away. That's all for tonight.